Good morning, everybody. Welcome to this presentation on emotional health and growth for the high school level. My name is Catherine Korah. I am the coordinator of the Center of Excellence for Behavior Management. This presentation has been prepared for Eastern Townships with support staff in mind. However, of course, this presentation can be shared with any school and board throughout the province or country. Yes, support staff, but I'm also keeping other staff in mind as well. And so you'll notice later on in the presentation that I will cover portions that are for teachers, but that also focus specifically on support staff. And so this presentation will be divided into 3 sections. Oftentimes, when I present, I see the value of starting from the beginning and being able to lay the groundwork, to be able to make sense of things, and then we can talk about what to do, because it's very difficult to focus just on what to do when we don't have the foundational part. And so the presentation is divided into 3 sections. The first section, we're going to look at emotion, the nature of emotion. How do emotions work? How can we make sense of them? And from there, we're going to compare the difference between social emotional learning and nurturing emotional health and growth. And there is a distinction between the 2 approaches. And so I will take the time to walk this through with you. And then in the third part, we're going to finally get to the how, where we're going to look at through the lens of the pyramid of intervention. How can our school staff support students in nurturing emotional health and growth, from the classroom best practices, universal best practices, to looking at more targeted practices with groups, to looking at individualized support for those students that need above and beyond. So let's begin this journey with part 1, making sense of emotion. And so before I get into the details, I really kind of wanted to start from the beginning about what is it exactly that we need to know about emotions. And so first of all, there is a difference between emotions and feelings. Sometimes we use this interchangeably, where we talk about feeling something or emotions and so forth, and they're actually not the same. Emotions is the primitive part in our system, where we are not conscious of it. This is what pushes us to act. Whereas feelings is more of the way that we bring our emotions to consciousness. And so we're able to name it, we're able to recognize it, to talk about it. And so emotion is the foundation kind of primitive part, and feeling is the more of the cognition, the insight into our emotions. So I thought it was important to distinguish the 2, first of all. Second of all, not all emotions, although they may be felt, are necessarily felt vulnerably. And it's important for me to say this because this will explain to us why is it that sometimes students can talk about certain emotions and others, they will act on them, but they're not able to name them, recognize them. And when we talk to them about it, that they may even shut down and so forth. And so the role of defenses are there to protect our brain from wounding or overwhelm. And so for certain people, certain emotions might be more easy to tolerate, and we're able to be more attuned to them. And there's other emotions for which we are not able to allow ourselves to feel them, at least not in that moment, for different reasons. And so it's important for me to name this because if we think that it's an all or nothing and that students are able to talk about their emotions and yet still act on other emotions and not be able to name them, this is why, because not all emotions are the same, and that some of them we feel more vulnerably and others we do not allow ourselves to do so. Now, emotions can be actually quite messy, can be noisy, can be chaotic. And although it may be quite uncomfortable, this is not a dysfunction. The brain has its reasons as to why the emotion will push us in certain directions. It is actually quite adaptive. There are other authors besides Gordon Neufeld that talk about emotions and about the neuroscience behind emotions. Stephen Porges is a good example. Mona de la Hook, who writes on behavior and mentions Stephen Porges in her writing, talks a lot about the neuroception of which is the way that we will pick up danger in our environment, the way that we will recognize whether or not we are safe. And so the behaviors that will come out, that reaction that will come out, that flight, fight, freeze response is actually quite adaptive. Although we may do certain things that are very chaotic or very noisy or very disturbing, it doesn't mean that this is a dysfunction. The other piece that I should mention is that emotional self-control, and we're going to talk about this. The word typically that we use is self-regulation. And so you'll notice that the language that I use is a little different from what you may be used to hearing. And so emotional self-control is not the absence of emotion. Sometimes we have the reflex when a student is reacting to try to get them to contain it or to shut it down or to kind of push it aside to bring forward calmness or happiness and so forth. And so in order for us to find our capacity to control our emotions, the key is not for us to suppress or to compress. It's that not the absence of emotion that will bring us to self-control. And I will talk about more about that in a moment. I just kind of wanted to name it here. And emotions themselves, although they are chaotic, noisy, and messy, I mentioned that they are adaptive and that they have a reason. And so in itself, they are not the problem. Although they may cause problems in relationship, in the social environment, and so forth, at the foundation, emotions are actually there for a reason, and they're actually trying to solve the problem at the forefront. And so when we think about the flight, fight, freeze response, the person who has a fight response or a freeze response or a flight response is trying to solve the problem of a sense of unsafety. And so the emotion in itself is not the problem. And so how can we try to help support our students that are having emotions and acting out of them? Now, the next section that we're going to look at is to walk through the 3 laws of emotion. The first law is that emotions need to move. This is not something that we choose. This is not something that is conscious. This is something that happens to us. And so emotions need to move. They need to be released and expressed, whether we like it or not. And even if, situationally, we are able to suppress emotion temporarily for survival purposes, it will eventually find an out. And so emotions need to move. The second law that we're going to look at is that emotions require to be felt in order to fulfill their job, in order to let their potential run their course. And we're gonna kind of unfold this a little bit in a minute. And the third one is that emotions aim for balance. But however, balance, being able to control your emotions to find that balance is not something that we're born with. It is something that grows and develops. And so it requires developmental readiness in order for it to happen. And of course, it requires the right conditions that if we are constantly in survival mode, there's not enough room in our body to focus on survival and to focus on growth. And so the more that a student has gone through adversity, has gone through trauma and so forth, and that their brains are occupied with survival, this has unfortunately taken away from the ability to put much energy on growth, and this will impact the ability to balance our emotions. And so sometimes, depending on the student and their background and history, we have this reflex to push for emotional balance, for self-regulation prematurely when the student is not ready for that. And so what can we do for those students that are not at that place? So we're going to walk through these 3 different laws. And so for the first law, I mentioned that emotions seek to move. They seek to move through release, whether it is a physiological release or through some sort of expression. And when I say expression, it could be through words, but it could also be through a non-verbal type of expression, movement, drawing. There's so many different other ways that we can express emotions. Music can move us in our emotions that is not through words. And so we need to understand that emotions is kind of like an electric charge. And so once we are triggered in the brain by something that pushes us, when we have an electrical charge, the brain looks for a discharge. It looks for a way out. And so emotions need to be expressed to preserve a healthy functioning and well-being. If we don't allow for emotions to run their course, they will take a toll on our mental health. And we will get to that in a second. But I wanted to look at the brain for a second to really reiterate to what degree our brains do the job unconsciously, and whether we like it or not. It is not something that we choose to do. It is something that happens to us. And so I mentioned before the word neuroception. The word neuroception is in the way in which our amygdala will pick up if we are in danger in our environment. Because we are beings of connection, and that survival is needed and necessary, our brain is constantly scanning in the environment whether or not we are safe. And so when the amygdala will pick up that there's a sense of danger, and remember that, for an individual who's gone through trauma or has had often some adversity in their life, the way in which their amygdala will pick up danger in the environment can be a bit, what's the word, impacted compared to an individual that has not gone through trauma. And those individuals with a traumatic background will pick up danger in their environment, even though there isn't an actual danger. Their brain is seeing it like as if there is. Something was triggered in their brain. Maybe they've made an association to something that happened in their past and so forth. And once the amygdala has registered the threat, it's kind of like a smoke detector that will send a signal. It will then speak to the hypothalamus. It will send a signal to the hypothalamus, and then the hypothalamus will activate the stress response in the body through the sympathetic nervous system. And what we call the flight, fight, freeze response is what comes out of the sympathetic nervous system. And all of this happens within what we call the limbic part of the brain. This is the emotional part of the brain. And so all of this happens, like I mentioned, in an unconscious, primitive kind of way. So emotions have two jobs to do. And I'm generalizing here because, of course, each individual emotion has their own individual task. But the overall task of emotions are the two following. The first one, the immediate task, is survival. And so our emotions are there to push us to act in order to move ourselves to safety. And the second reason, the more ultimate reason, the long-term reason for emotions, is to help us grow up. And so we used to think that it was actually thought, it was cognition that was the more sophisticated part of the brain, and that allowed for us to gain maturity and to grow up, only for us to find out through neuroscience that it is actually emotion's job, the emotional part of the brain. It's their job to grow us up. And I'll show you more concretely what it is that I'm talking about. But before I get there, I want to focus first on the first law of emotion, as to the fact that it needs to move. And so although that emotion needs to move and to be expressed, the expression of that emotion, as I mentioned before, can be quite messy, noisy, chaotic. And in our society, it can be looked upon as unacceptable. It can be quite alienating depending on the type of emotion, and wounding to others. And so emotions, although have a job to do in relationship at times, depending on the way that it is expressed, can actually threaten relationship, or at least the teen or the student can pick up that their emotions and then the way that they push them to act can affect relationships and threaten relationships. Even if adults are quite warm and present and inviting, it's all in the way that the student perceives it. So if because relationship attachment is our most preeminent need, we are beings of connection, it is also our biggest threat to be isolated. And so if a student were to pick up that their behaviors will threaten relationship, in order to protect relationship at all costs, what the brain will do temporarily is it will attempt to suppress or depress the emotion to protect the attachment, especially if the emotional expression is considered to be unacceptable. And so this is a visual just to explain what it is that I'm talking about. And so if an individual picks up in their day-to-day exchanges with their village of attachments, that there are only certain emotions that are welcome and accepted, and that other emotions around there can threaten relationships, can alienate relationships, and so forth, then the brain will attempt for attachment purposes to suppress emotions temporarily. And I'm emphasizing the word temporarily because even if we want to suppress for survival purposes, for connection purposes, the brain can only do this for so long. The other thing that might impact in the way that the view, the perception of the student vis-a-vis their own emotions and whether or not they are accepted is in the way in which their environment will react to their emotions. Sometimes we have the reflex, rather than letting emotions run their course, if a student is upset, the natural course would be to let them get through their upset, find their adaptation, and from there they will bounce back and get recovery. But oftentimes our reflex is to go against the wave of emotion and to try to get quickly to a solution where we will try to confront the irrationality of if the student is acting a certain way and that what they're doing doesn't make sense, that we will try to rationalize it and for them to kind of suppress that reaction because it doesn't make sense in the moment, that we will try to contain that impulsivity, that we will try to focus on being positive, that student that might be depressed, sad, or angry, that we might focus on being positive, trying to pursue that happiness at all costs. And we might try to focus on self-regulation prematurely, trying to pursue calmness and tranquility at all costs. And so all of these things that are a very much of a cognitive approach or a behavioral approach, they actually work against the nature of emotions and they prevent from emotions to run their course. And so if emotions don't get to run their course, even if they contain themselves temporarily because of the attachment alarm or because of the adult pressure, or I'm saying adult, but it could be, peer pressure as well, eventually it will find its own way out. And then this is when it's going to start taking tangents. And so it's important for us to make space for emotions to run their course. And I'm not saying that we should allow for students to act out in any way, shape, or form at any time or place. Of course, we need to put limits and boundaries, and to establish safety. But it is important for us to build in a day time where there is space and time for emotions to run their course. I noticed there was a hand up. Just so you know, I'm recording right now the presentation. I won't be answering questions just yet. And so please put your questions in the chat if you're worried about forgetting the question. And when I'm done the presentation, I will answer questions at the end. Thank you so much. And so a quote from a book that I really love from Mark Brackett called Permission to Feel. I pulled out a sentence from that book. And Mark Brackett says that the irony is that when we ignore our feelings or suppress them, they only become stronger. The really powerful emotions build up inside us like a dark force that inevitably poisons everything we do, whether we like it or not. Hurt feelings don't vanish on their own. They don't heal themselves. If we don't express our emotions, they pile up like a debt that will eventually come due. There's another book that I've read called Burnout. And in that book, the author mentions that the reason why people bring themselves to a place of burnout is because they don't allow themselves to complete the loop of their emotions. And so for us to be able to make space and time for students to talk about their emotions or to at least express them in a nonverbal way if they don't want to use words to talk about their emotions, but it is so needed and necessary for them to do that. Because if they don't, unfortunately, over time, this has a toll on the body. And so there's evidence, there's research that has shown that suppressing emotions show consequences on physical health, mental health, and general well-being, including problems around attention, problems around concentration, around memory. that there are high daily emotional stresses and dysregulation that happens in the body, that there's negative social functioning that can come from that because of the accumulation of emotion, and that then the emotions will take a tangent. That there's a number of physical aggressions and bullying incidences that have increased, that this could lead to illicit drug use in order to function because the emotions are not doing their job properly. This can have a toll on psychological distress, including eating disorders and self-injury. There are much increase in diagnosed mental health conditions in our youth nowadays, including anxiety and depression. And there are long-term health problems on the body, including insomnia, poor digestion, physical pain, weakened immune system, heart disease, and so forth. And so you've got here the the two references to all of this. And there is much more. There's statistics that have shown the increase in our youth nowadays in terms of increase of mental health and lack of well-being. Part of the reason why this is not happening is not just because our adolescents are not expressing their emotions, but also because they are not building resiliency. Resiliency is that capacity to bounce back from adversity, that although you've lived something that is difficult and that it was hard for you to get through it, that you were still able to get past it and to bounce back from that situation. And so this is what we call resilience. This is the key to emotional health and growth. There are three different keys that allow for resilience to unfold. And we're going to walk through all three at different times in this presentation. But you see here that emotional expression, allowing for emotions to come out and to run their course, is one of the three keys in order to build resiliency. Another way to look at this is the steps towards emotional health and maturity. This comes from Gordon Neufeld's material on the science of emotion. And so Gordon Neufeld says that in order for us to be able to regulate our emotions, he calls this mixing. And for us to be able to reflect on our emotions, these cannot happen before. And so we walk through the three first steps. And so these steps are meant to be done sequentially. You cannot name emotions that you don't express. Emotions need to move in order to recognize them and to be able to put the right word on it. And so expression is the first step in. Being able to have the words, of course, to name your emotions, or that you have, for some students that don't have the words, at least if they're able through symbols or illustrations to present, to explain the matching that concept to the feeling, to the emotion, excuse me, that this is all right as well. It's not necessarily just words. Feeling, I mentioned before, is not the same as emotion. And so in order for us to feel our emotions, we need to allow ourselves to remain vulnerable. And so students that have adversity in their lives, that have built defendedness to be able to protect themselves from the wounding and the overwhelm, what happens is that defenses don't get to choose what they defend and what they don't. And so a student that has a lot of defendedness will not necessarily feel their emotions. It doesn't mean that emotions are not still releasing themselves and so forth. There isn't just a consciousness of that. And so if you don't have consciousness of your emotions, you don't have the raw material to be able to regulate them. And so I'll talk about mixing later on in this presentation. And without this, you cannot reflect on emotions. And so all of that is the very needed steps, one after the other. And so us as adults, our focus, our priority is not to get students to reflect on their emotions. We're going about this backwards. We need to make sure that students have developed all of these different capacities before we could even talk about reflecting on our emotions. And so our role, our priority in our role is to make space and time for them to express those emotions. And so sometimes, just letting it out in a safe way, of course, and ideally in a place where it's not in public, to be able to preserve their dignity. And so just being able to let that out, venting, talking to us about their frustrations or their fears and so forth, can be so therapeutic. The other piece can be quite therapeutic is for them to find their tears. But of course, not all students can allow themselves to feel tears. Some of them are very defended, and tears are actually quite uncomfortable. And so don't allow themselves to feel tears. Now, I think it's important that I name here that there's actually different types of tears. We can tear to cutting onions. We can tear to laughter. We can tear to frustration, but we can also tear to deep sorrow, to deep sadness, to grief. And so those are the tears that we're looking for. And they actually the composition of those tears are actually quite different from the composition of the other tears. And so in those tears, the composition are made of the stress hormone cortisol and the mood regulating hormone oxytocin. And so these are actually needed and necessary. This is, when we have a good cry and that after that we feel relief, this is why, because we've released at that point the stress hormones at the same time. And so, of course, for some of our students that can allow themselves to get to those tears because it is too difficult for them to be in that vulnerable place, can we try to find an alternative for them to be able to release some of that emotion? And we've actually been able to realize now that being in the play mode can safeguard the ability to feel emotion, even though it is not for real, even though it may not even be our own emotions. We may be playing a character in a drama, in a play, that the brain doesn't know the difference between us feeling our own emotions and us feeling emotions of a character. And so to be able to let out these emotions in the play mode can be a way through for some of these students that are very shut down. And so the beauty of play, what play brings forth, is that it is quite engaging. I just realized here the word is fun, but it can be fun depending on the type of play that we're using. But the word engaging would have been more appropriate here. And of course, we have a sense of safety because we know it's not for real. We know that there's not true repercussions. And in the play mode, in the true play, we allow ourselves to be expressive and exploratory in a very free type of way. And so it's not meant to be work. It is meant to be exploratory, and it is not for real. So there's not true repercussions. And so what play has to offer emotion is a work-free space for development to take place, to protect our feelings, to be able to express emotions without repercussions. And so studies have found that just to show you to what extent play has an impact, not just emotion and sadness and tears, but play as well. And so they've done studies with rats to be able to see if we were to deprive them from play, what would happen. And so studies have found that play-deprived rats are particularly impaired under novel, changeable, or challenging situations. And so we see that they're not able to adapt. They're not resilient. They're not able to bounce back from adversity. And more than that, they evoke more aggression, incur more injuries, take more time to assume a submissive posture, and show inappropriate exploration of the resident's territory after defeat. Remember, we're talking about rats here. And so the way that rats play is actually to pounce on each other and to do play fighting. And so a rat that has not been introduced to play and have been deprived from play don't know how to interact in the play mode if they haven't had that opportunity. And then we can see much more aggression, moving more to injury and so forth. And so we can compare this to people, kids that have been deprived of true play, being able to explore their emotions in the play mode, to try out different things, play fight, for example, that all of that takes a toll on the person if they haven't been exposed to it. Studies have also shown that play-deprived animals display an increase in levels of anxiety. And so I can't help but think, if we go back to that previous thing that statistics or that I was mentioning here, that also in our human population, there's an increase in mental health issues. And so David Elkind, who has written The Power of Play, has mentioned that over the past 2 decades, youth have lost 12 hours of free time a week, including 8 hours of unstructured play and outdoor activities. And so we can't imagine, those are the kids that are more on their screens, that are indoors playing video games and so forth. This is not considered true play to be on social media or to play video games and so forth. And so the impact that this has had over our youth. Stuart Brown, in the Encyclopedia of Play, has written that outdoor play has decreased by 71% just in one generation, both in the US and in the UK. And so not only are our kids not playing, but they're also not outdoors as well. And so the impact of the loss of being outdoors, being in nature, has had an impact. And so escalating diagnosis of childhood anxiety, depression, and ADHD has paralleled the loss of play, which has been found by Peter Gray in the American Journal in 2011. And I can't even imagine, we're talking about studies back in 2011. Sorry, guys, give me a second. My apologies. And so, now we're in 2024. All of these years later, COVID has happened, and social media has increased, uses of devices have increased, and so forth. I can't imagine nowadays looking at these statistics. The second law of emotional health and growth is that emotions seek to be felt in order for them to feel to fulfill their job, to fulfill their potential. And so if emotions are not felt, if they haven't reached their consciousness, if we're not able to recognize them and to put words to them, then they cannot do their job. And so, for example, sadness cannot lead to healing and recovery without being felt. And of course, emotions require to be felt in order to be managed. And we'll talk about that in the third law. But just to say that the need for feelings of caring and responsibility, these are two good examples of emotions that allow for impulsivity to attack or the fear to avoid, can help soften and temper those impulses. And so emotions can only be felt if it is safe and that there is space. A quote from Hannah Beach. Hannah Beach wrote the book Reclaiming Our Students, and she also wrote this article called Kids Need a Safe Space to Feel. And so in her article, she wrote, our youth are experiencing an emotional crisis. They are more anxious, aggressive, and shut down than ever. We are seeing clear evidence in our schools, our homes, in our neighborhoods, our community spaces. The root cause of emotional crisis and resulting behavioral issues we see on the day-to-day is that our youth are losing their feelings. And so why is it that they're losing their feelings? What has changed in our society that has made that now our kids are not feeling their emotions in the same way than before? And so I have here a few examples. Society's pressure for the push for independence and self-control prematurely is a good example of that, because our kids, our youth, don't feel safe and don't feel taken care of. They don't feel that we understand them. They feel that we push for result above and beyond their need and their development. The impact of peer orientation, where our peers are more connected to each other than to us, the adults, has had an increase, an impact on losing feeling. There is more wounding interaction when peers are just oriented within themselves, because kids are not meant to be to protect kids. Kids are not meant to take care of kids. And so, of course, they're very egocentric, and there's much more wounding and less shielding that is happening from the adults when our youth are more oriented towards each other. The impact of screens, of digital devices and social media, because there's more superficial connection, much more wounding interactions. I mean, you know this, you see this with our, when peers are coming to us with some of their conflicts and so forth, how much of this stems from some of the digital world. The loss of respite. The fact that they're not able to find those pockets of time in their day to have rest without external stimulation, without having that creative solitude. This has been lost in our youth, where they are constantly stimulated by this outside, whether it's screens, devices, and so forth. All of that has had an impact on the loss of play, on the loss of feeling, excuse me. The loss of play, of course, I mentioned it before. The loss of family time, having meals around the table, playing board games and so forth, doing these weekends together, outdoors or whatnot. The loss of time with our youth, with adults, is having them orient to themselves much more. And the sad piece is that we're not even recognizing this in our culture, because it has become so normalized that at that age, that adolescents it is normal for them to hang out with each other. Normal, yes. Natural, no. And so we've lost sight of this. Gordon Neufeld wrote a book called Hold On to Your Kids. And this is what he talks about in his book. He just re-released his book recently with an added chapter on the impact on well-being and mental health. And he talks a lot about this, about the fact that peer orientation has the degree to which it is now is worse than ever, and how this has an impact on their sense of safety, and in turn has an impact on their feelings. And of course, our culture's lack of understanding around the need for emotion to be expressed. Youth will interpret this as emotional expression is not welcome, and that it has repercussions for relationships. So the way that the anatomy of emotions, the way that they work, is that at the foundation, you've got the chemistry, the physiological part. That's what I was explaining before with the brain. And then, of course, comes with that the emotions. Emotions will push the impulses. If we are lucky to be conscious of our emotions, we'll be able to have feelings, to recognize those. And only once all of that happens, with the increase of consciousness, will we lead to our perception. My apologies. One more second. This is what happens when I present from home and I have a dog. So my apologies. So if we look at this image this way, we can see with the iceberg, the analogy of the iceberg, that at the chemistry and physiological portion, we have all of what happens through the sympathetic nervous system, the adrenaline, the cortisol, and this impacts the heart rate, the blood pressure. This is the fight response or the flight response. And so all of this will push us to react. The emotion could be frustration, for example, or alarm. These are just two examples of very primitive emotions. The impulses would be that if we're frustrated, we would try at first to move to affect change, to make things work. Whereas if we're alarmed, our impulse would be to move to caution. And if we're able to feel that emotion, we would be able to say, if we're frustrated, that's not working. Or if we are alarmed, we would say something like, I'm scared. And that would give us the perception of our feelings, and then, of course, about what we would do from that. And so emotions become feeling when it is felt or become conscious. And feeling our emotions allow them to fulfill their destiny. And so it is possible, by the way, for us to have emotions, but not have the feeling. And so, for example, think about those students that are anxious, that are constantly feeling on edge. And so the alarm is there, but when you talk to them about, what's happening, they're not able to name, they're not able to recognize, they can't speak to that. And so this would be the emotion without the feeling. The same thing with a student that is acting out an attack, that might verbally, attack, or that they might physically attack. And so we could see that they're full of frustration, but when we talk to them about it, they're not able to recognize or to name what it is that impacts them. And so emotion can happen without feeling. The thing that happens, though, that if our feelings are lost, so of course emotions are still there, then what will happen is that rather than talking about what affects us, our emotions will push us to act. And so for the alarm, we may move to avoid, the impulse to avoid. And what will come from that is all of the symptoms from anxiety, having fears, being in hypervigilance mode, having anxiety reducing behaviors, having obsessions or compulsions, avoidance, agitation, and so forth. And so all of this will come from the fact that the alarm is not being felt. And so the problem's not the alarm. Remember before I had said the problem's not the emotion's trying to do the job. The problem here is that we're not feeling our emotions. And so if we are able to feel our alarm, then we can talk about it and get through it and past it. But if we're not able to feel our alarm and recognize it, then it will move to all sorts of different tangents, and we're not able to resolve it, because all of these different things that our body's trying to do are attempts to try to resolve the problem. But because we're not able to recognize it, oftentimes these attempts are not done in the right direction. And so they really won't have the true impact that they need to have. And the same thing with frustration, that if our impulse is to attack because we're so frustrated, then this will move into things like, at the softest of attack, being impatient, being abrupt, being rude, being irritable. As we're moving forward, and a bigger impulse to attack, having an outburst or some sort of tantrum, an eruption of attacking energy. And so again, the problem is not the frustration. Frustration has a job to do. Both emotions have a job to do. The job of the alarm is to protect us from danger. It is the purpose is survival. And frustration, the purpose of frustration is for us to be able to persevere, for us to have determination. And so there's a value to frustration. The problem is not frustration itself. The problem is when frustration takes a turn and that we're not able to feel our frustration and that it becomes over the top. Then the problem is all of the behaviors that will ensue from that. And so the solution here is not for us to shut down the frustration. The solution here is for us to help our students feel their emotions, to get back into connection with their emotions so they can find a way out, so they can find outlets to be able to release that alarm and that frustration in a safe way so they don't get to these resulting behaviors. So there are three necessary requirements for emotions to be felt. For emotions to be felt, they need to move. And so if you've got the brain that defends the emotions temporarily, and that there isn't movement in that moment because they're suppressed, then you cannot feel emotions that don't move. The other thing is that we need to be able to name those emotions, whether it's through words or through symbols and images, but that we're able to give it a consciousness and a concept, from the experience to the thought. And of course, the most important is that it must feel safe, that the student must have a heart that is soft enough, vulnerable enough to feel safe enough to be able to feel their emotions. Without safety, there is no possibility for them to feel, because they are then trying to focus on survival more than focusing on being vulnerable and open and to feel their emotions. So I mentioned before that there are three keys to resiliency. The first one I walked through was the emotional expression. The second one is the sense of safety. And so without feeling safe, and I'll explain different examples of where the sense of safety stems from, there's no capacity for resilience and to be able to nurture emotional health and growth. So safety is the starting point. And so here are some examples that can allow for safety to run its course. The first one is giving priority to prevention work, because if we only intervene when the student is upset, the student is not in the right frame of mind to be able to receive that support and accompaniment. It is a very different experience, both for the student and for the adult who's accompanying that student, to work in the prevention mode versus working in the crisis mode. They're not receptive in that moment when they're in the crisis mode. It has been proven that the first thing that goes when they are upset, when they are dysregulated, is the auditory processing. They are not hearing us, what it is that we need to say to be able to help them get through it. And so it is important for us to find pockets of time and space to address these things when they are at a state of rest. And so this way, if we provide check-ins and not wait for them to be upset or dysregulated, and that we do this on a regular basis, and that we're able to walk through certain things, this will be so much more beneficial. The other thing that is needed and necessary for safety to occur is through the environment. You know, how many students require that structure, that routine, that predictability for the physical and social setup of the space to be set up in a way that is intentional, that we think about the sensory needs of that student, whether it's through, you know, too much noise, whether it's through the sound, the sight, too many people in their bubble and so forth. And so, sorry guys, my dog's making such a funny noise. And honoring inclusive practices. And so thinking about our neurodiverse population, those kids that that get impacted by their physical environment, trying to figure out from the lighting to you know, the room not being too cluttered and so forth. All of that needs to be taken into consideration for those types of kids. Portraying us as adults, portraying ourselves as strong and tempered. And so it doesn't mean that we have things under control. Of course, you know, when we're working with a student that is dysregulated or that is upset and that things are just, you know, out of hand, it doesn't mean that we're able to control the student, but it is so vital and important for us to portray ourselves like we've got this, like we're there for them. We need to focus more on our own energy, focusing on our trying to remain calm, trying to remain tempered, being able to show to the student that we've got them, we've got this, and that we'll take care of the circumstances. And I'll give examples later of that. And so another example would be to greet and engage the student. You know, relationship is their most preeminent need. And so it's important to engage them, to greet them, not just focus on you know, the agenda of you know, if are they behaving properly, are they doing the schoolwork properly. We want them to feel like we are interested in them being there with us. And it's not always easy. It's more easy to be said than done. Of course, those very challenging students can trigger us. But to be able to greet them, to engage them, to show some warmth, some delight, some enjoyment when we're spending some time with them, calling them by their name, the fact that we know their name is proof that we care, that we're invested, being actively involved beyond academics, meeting them at their interest, remembering what is important to them, listening to them with full attention. All of this makes a difference. It helps them to feel safe, to feel understood, to feel taken care of. Moving away from discipline practices that cause separation, that we put them, you know, let's say they've misbehaved in the classroom, and so now we've sent them to the reflection room, or you know, they get these consequences that that just will cause more sense of a separation for them. Trying to find ways, if they do need to leave the classroom or that they need to go home because they've had, you know, a difficult day, that we find a way to preserve their dignity, and that we do this in a way that we say to them, although they've had a difficult day, that we, you know, tomorrow's another day, let's try again, and to show that we haven't given up on them, that we believe in their ability to be able to grow. And so offering a variety of emotional playgrounds through in order to express emotions with or without words, because some students can talk very well about their emotions and their emotional experience, and some students can't go there. The second that you sit face to face and you start talking to them about their emotions, they just close up like a clam. And so for those kids, you know, making space through, I don't know, it could be through music, through journaling, through art, through so many different mediums that are out there, and remembering that we need to move away from being in our thoughts. We need to focus on being on the emotional experience, not being in the fix it mode, letting emotions run their course, trusting that nature has a plan, inviting them to share their thoughts and feelings, whether it's through words or other. And another example, in terms of sense of safety that are, are factors, is looking at what are those protective factors for those kids, whether it's through the presence of secure attachments, having a good sense of belonging to the school. How many kids don't have a very strong sense of belonging to the school? So to be able to build that for them, even if it's not in every single classroom, could it be maybe through some sort of activity that they do at school that they really enjoy doing, putting them into interest clubs, and then of course having the availability for support measures that are well adapted to the students' needs. Giving access to healthy and positive extracurricular activities through sports, through arts, and having a strong home school relationship. How often the impact of the divide between home and school has an impact on our students, because they feel very torn between being loyal to their family and of course wanting to belong to the school and feeling caught in the in between. And so the more that we can work on the relationship between home and school, the more we can help the student feel like it's not either or, but that all of their village of attachment work together. Now, it's important for us to understand that safety, the sense of safety, is not just the absence of threat. I reminded before that we are connection, we are beings of connection. Attachment is our most preeminent need, and so it is of course just as important the presence of connection. And also keeping in mind that safety is in the eye of the beholder, which means that even if we believe that we are a warm, inviting adult, that we've set up the environment in a way that is supportive for the student, how are they interpreting it? How are they feeling? Are they in a place where they can be at rest and feeling safe? And so it's important to ask, you guys are working at the high school level, and so it is needed and necessary to have this dialogue with the student to get their feedback about what is it that triggers them, makes them feel unsafe, and in turn, what is it that helps them, that soothes them, that helps them feel safe. And so to be able to honor and make space for their feedback. The third law of emotion is that emotions seek balance by mixing emotions, and I will explain that in a second, but only when developmentally ready. And so the capacity for self-control and consideration needs to develop, but it can only develop when the conditions are favorable and that they're optimal, because if they're not, then the student will be in survival mode. And so what will bring balance, stability, the capacity to reflect, self-control and consideration, and this requires for us to be able to mix emotions. And so in order for us to be able to mix our emotions, we need to have a well-functioning prefrontal cortex. For those who have heard me speak before, I talk often about the prefrontal cortex. And the reason why I keep on bringing it up is because it is so central. A student that has gone through trauma and adversity may not have a well-developed prefrontal cortex, because the energy has gone more for survival than has gone for growth. And so only if the right conditions were there that the prefrontal cortex will grow. However, I just want to reiterate that so you've got here the picture of a 5-year-old to maybe a 12-year-old to a 15-year-old to a 20-year-old. And the more that we have blue matter, the blue and purple is the parts, the brain that is more mature. And so we see that the 5-year-old, obviously it has barely even begun. The same thing with the 11, 12-year-old. When they start to come in grade 7 at the high school level, many of our students, especially those that have gone through adversity, probably have a brain of a preteen, and so they don't have just yet a well-functioning prefrontal cortex. And so when they're calm, maybe they're able to access some of the fruit of that, but when they're upset, there is no way that they can engage it. And if we think about our neurodiverse population, those kids that are hypersensitive, that development also delays. And so typically the gap is 5 to 7 for the beginning of the development of the prefrontal cortex, and that's pushed to a 7 to 9-year-old with the hypersensitive. And I repeat, the beginning of, it takes years and years and years. I mean, if you look here to the teen to the 20-year-old, only at the 20-year-old, if all the right conditions are there, do we get the true fruit of the prefrontal cortex development. And so development is spontaneous, but of course, if the right conditions are there, it is not inevitable. And for those that go through hardship, they need to get that support in order to compensate for that, because they will not grow without having that sense of safety and rest. So teens cannot manage emotions. The other thing that I've mentioned before, that they do not feel, and that they cannot feel emotions that are not named or expressed. And so if this is not happening, the feeling and the expression, then there is no way that we can get to managing emotions. So self-control is not on the developmental agenda until the 5th year of life. Of course, if all the right conditions are there, and is not a reliable capacity. And so even if the potential is there, it's only if the development is optimal. And even if it is, there's several years that need to unfold before the capacity can be more reliable. And so even us as adults, think about us when we're having a bad week and that we've been stressed. And by the end of the week, all of a sudden, we're much less patient, and that we surprise ourselves with our impulses and so forth. And so even though we might be very well developed, there's a difference between being very well developed and being able to access the capacity, the potential. And so we need to be in a good place to be at rest, to not be too stressed, to not be sick, to not be hungry. All of that has an impact on being able to access that potential. And of course, it does not respond, the capacity to self-control does not respond to a direct approach. Us telling a student to calm down is not going to make a student calm down. It might actually make them more frustrated. And so trying to take shortcuts, trying to put pressure on teens for results, not only is it going against the developmental approach, but it can also cause more harm than good. And so for our immature teens that are stuck developmentally, here is what's happening in the lack of the development in their brain. And so not only do they have an underdeveloped cerebellum, and so it's not just the prefrontal cortex, it's also the underdeveloped cerebellum, and this will impact their capacity to access information efficiently and quickly. And so even if we were to teach tools to a teen about, and those tools are there to help them manage their emotions, that when they are upset, very upset, and that they're quite immature, they're not able to access that information easily because of the underdeveloped cerebellum. Because they have an underdeveloped corpus callosum, this has an impact on them being able to see the whole picture. And so the student has a hard time having perspective. So when we're talking about them having empathy, and acting on that, it is very difficult for a student with an underdeveloped corpus callosum to have empathy because they cannot see the whole picture. They're not able to focus on themselves and others. Consideration for others is very difficult when we're quite immature. And also, as I mentioned before, when your prefrontal cortex is underdeveloped, this has an impact on our capacity to have mixed feelings and thoughts. And this will not allow for us to temper our emotions. And so as a result, those teens often know better, but they cannot do better as emotions overwhelm their reason. So behavior will improve only when that maturation occurs, and this takes time. And so in the meantime, they need us. They need the adults to help them temper their emotions, for us to accompany them, to have our calm meet their storm, and to accompany them. And so emotional co-regulation comes first, and then this makes way eventually to emotional self-regulation, and that can develop, but only if we accompany them first. We need to be able to introduce this, to model this, to support them in that until they can get there on their own. And so emotion regulation is not about exerting tight control over what we feel. And it's not about banishing those negative emotions and feeling only the positive ones. Rather, emotion regulation starts with giving ourselves and others the permission to our own feelings, all of them. And so what we mean there is that what mixing the mixing means, if we go back to that step here, and we're talking about mixing is key. So it's not about removing, like if we were to be upset and to act out on frustration, the key here is not to remove frustration. The key here is to find the patience in order to neutralize. And so in order to find your patience, sometimes having caring emotions, caring about not wanting to hurt the person that that we feel frustrated with, that we have the impulse to attack, or that we care about the consequences in life, and so forth. Having courage is not having the fear. Courage is to be motivated to push through regardless of the fear. And so emotional self-control is not the absence of emotion. It is the fruit of mixed feelings, which comes from integrated functioning. And so all of these different fruits, whether we're talking about empathy, courage, patience, forgiveness, having integrity and self-sacrifice, all of this are fruit of mixed feelings. And so if we were to look at patience more deeply, so patience is the fruit between the impulse to attack and the desire to attach. And so even if we have the impulse to strike, to bite, to insult, to put down, to hurt, to yell at, to be sarcastic, to loathe, to ignore, to tantrum, and so forth, that the desire to keep close, to take care of, to care for, to protect from hurt, to be loyal to not push away, to avoid upsetting, to not want to disappoint, to measure up to have feelings of affection. This is what is needed in order to neutralize the impulse to attack. The same thing with courage. And so we may have the fear, of being away from home, of being laughed at, appearing stupid, losing popularity, being seen as different, not being interesting, not meeting approval, having to let go, not measuring up, being alone. All of this brings fear in us, and it pushes us to avoid. But in order to find our motivation to plow through, even though we're afraid, we need to trump it with the desire to engage in an activity, finding that interest, that motivation, that desire to take part into something fun because we're missing out if we're avoiding it, to ask those questions that we want to have those answers to stand up for a friend, to wear what we like, even though we may look different, to share a story, to express an opinion, to get attached and involved, to belong, to pursue a passion, to be yourself. All of this is what is needed and necessary to neutralize the fear. And so when we have courage, we're still afraid. So we haven't taken away the fear, but we're able to soften that fear with our desires. And so our role as adults is to help them see the other side, on the other hand, to be able to bring the two together. But this needs maturation. It requires for us to have perspective, because when you're immature, when you don't have prefrontal cortex functioning, you're not able to see two things at once. You're not able to have two emotions that neutralize each other. You're in the one emotion, the one thought. And so if we can work on setting up those conditions for them to feel safe and to be able to express those emotions, and this will lead to growth and resiliency, these things will unfold on their own naturally. And so our job is not to push the fruit or to teach the fruit. Our job is to set up the conditions and to inspire and to be that role model. The other thing that I want to mention that is so needed and necessary, and we talked about it in that previous section, is the need to feel our emotions. Because if you cannot feel your emotions, then you have nothing to work with to be able to mix those two emotions and to temper them, to neutralize them. And so if we look at it this way, without having a sense of caring, without having a sense of responsibility, none of these fruit can happen. You cannot have patience without caring and responsibility. The same thing with courage. If you don't have the desire to face your fears, you cannot get courage. And so it's not about teaching these as thinking that it's a skill to gain. It is about trying to get them to feel their emotions. And so when we focus on the behavioral approach, on the cognitive approach, and that we do this prematurely, and that we focus on the result, we push for students to be good, to be kind, to be nice, to be considerate, to calm down, to not be upset, to settle down, and so forth. And when we do this, when we focus on things divorced from context, then unfortunately, none of the steps can happen. Because without expression, without naming, without feeling, there will no be self-regulation or co-regulation even, and will not lead to reflection. Our job here, our relationship to the teen's feelings is to invite emotion, to make room for expression, to help them find the words, to model not just the words, but to model matching the words to the right emotion. How oftentimes students have the words rotely, but when they're experiencing that emotion, they don't even know what word goes with what. And so to be able to name those emotions, to feel safe enough, to vulnerable enough to allow for emotions to run their course and to feel them. To model what does that look like mixing emotions, to be able to help them find their courage, to be able to help them temper that frustration. And so when we're working on this, then they need to build their own relationship with their feelings. They're mixing and they're reflecting. And only once they've done that to their own feelings, can they eventually have a relationship with other people's feelings. And so for us to ask for them to be considerate and empathetic requires for them to, first of all, have a relationship with their own feelings. And so if they are defended, if they're shut down, if they're stuck emotionally, if they're depressed, if they are anxious to a point where they're so self-absorbed, there's no way that they can have empathy and consideration and have a relationship with other people's feelings. And so our job is to set the stage for them to be able to have the steps that unfold naturally. So this walks into, for us, the second part of this presentation, which is what is the difference really between social emotional learning and nurturing emotional health and growth? And so before I talk about emotional health and growth, I want to set the stage a little bit for social emotional learning, just in case, some of you may not have this information. And so first of all, social emotional learning, what is it exactly? And so it is an educational method that aims to foster social and emotional skills within a school curricula. And so it emphasizes social and emotional skills to the same degree as other subject areas like math and science and reading. And so the premise of social emotional learning is that we start off with a blank slate and that we are there to teach those skills. Social emotional learning began in the 60s at the Yale School of Medicine in Child Study Center. Professor James Comer studied the education system of low-income families in the African American communities due to their poor academic report cards. And they implemented competence-based programs that focused on the social and emotional needs of the students. And this is where SEL began. In 1987, Roger Weisberg, Timothy Shriver, and other researchers and educators established the New Haven Social Development Program. And this was based out of the studies that were done in the 60s. And they continue to push through trying to see the impact of social and emotional learning. In 1994, the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning, this is what CASEL stands for. For those who know CASEL program, it's probably one of the most renowned SEL programs that is out there. And so it stands for the Collaborative for Academic, Social, and Emotional Learning was founded. 1997, the CASEL participants published promoting social and emotional learning. They put together a guidelines for educators. The organization that had led the way to bring SEL into the schools worldwide. They did so many studies within their program that they were able to demonstrate the benefits of their program, and this led to a worldwide spread of SEL. SEL is actually closely linked to Daniel Goleman's construct of emotional intelligence, and that emotions can actually be schooled. And Roger Weisberg acknowledges, he's the one that created the CASEL model. He acknowledges on his website that the only programs that demonstrate lasting results involve a parent-child relationship component to the program. And so he's been able to demonstrate that it's not just about teaching the skills of emotions, that what is needed and necessary for those programs to be successful is to have the parent-child relationship. Interesting. and it's interesting that that hasn't been brought up more in terms of the actual program. So here's the visual of the Castle framework, where social emotional learning to them is divided into 5 different areas: self-awareness, self-management, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, and social awareness. And so these 5 areas of social emotional learning are focused on not just in the classroom through instruction and the classroom climate, excuse me, but also looking at the school approach, looking at the school-wide culture practices and policies, also looking at the families and caregivers, the authentic partnership with the families and caregivers, and of course with the communities. And so aligned learning opportunities with the communities. And so oftentimes SEL, the 3, the school, families, and community, has been forgotten, and we're very much focused on the classroom approach, where we focus on solely pushing for these 5 attributes to grow, not to grow, to unfold, to be learned. And so if we were to look at it this way, so these are the 5 different areas. In self-awareness, what they're looking for is for the student to be able to identify emotions, to have accurate self-perception, to recognize their strength, and to have self-confidence. In self-management, what they're looking for is to have impulse control, stress management, self-discipline, self-motivation, goal setting, and organizational skills. In social awareness, we're looking at perspective taking, empathy, appreciating diversity, and respect for others. In relationship skills, we are looking for good communication, social engagement, relationship building, and teamwork. And the last one, responsible decision making, is focused on identifying problems, analyzing situations, solving problems, evaluating, reflecting, and ethical responsibility. And so this is what social emotional learning is about. It is about teaching these different skills in a very academic type of way. Hannah Beach, for whom I quoted before in her article called "Kids Need a Safe Space to Feel," wrote the following in her articles: emotional health cannot be taught. Building emotional health calls for experiences that put us in touch with the full spectrum of human emotions, even the ones that we often try so hard to avoid. Change doesn't begin with managing our emotions as an intellectual process that we systematically think through in the heat of the moment. Change, true, deep, long-lasting change, is something that comes from the inside out. It begins with feeling our emotions, being truly aware of them, having the space to express them, and then acting on them in ways that are appropriate. It is at the emotional level that the deepest, most long-lasting changes occur. And it is on this level that we have to engage our kids if we want them to support their emotional well-being. So nurturing emotional health and growth, to the contrary of social emotional learning, is a lifelong process. And it starts with the adults, not with the kids. It is needed to be an experiential process. It is about for the adults to set up the conditions for emotional health and growth to unfold naturally, rather than focusing on teaching the skills prematurely. It needs to be peppered into our everyday life, and it can be built in implicitly, infused in our day-to-day activities. And it can work better for some if the experience is done in the play mode, because the indirect non-threatening indirect non-threatening expressive activities, because for them the direct mode is too vulnerable. So emotional health and growth isn't just about self-regulation. Students' success and well-being rely on the adult's intent to provide the right conditions and to manage the circumstances instead of trying to control the student's behavior at all cost. Laurie Deshotel, who wrote Connections Over Compliance, says that social emotional learning needs to be redefined. It is about the health of our nervous system. It is about recognizing our sensations. It is much more about the adults as it is the students. And so the experiences that support a sense of safety and connection that help students to soften their defenses and that leads to them being vulnerable, to be wholehearted, requires for the adults to be tenderhearted and caring, warm and gentle, offering warm and gentle care, which comes from empathy, compassion, and vulnerability on the part of the adult. That it requires the adult to carry out their role and responsibility in fulfilling the student's attachment needs. That it requires reflective practices on the part of the adult, whether it were giving priority to prevention, teamwork, co-caring among us, using the mirrors to look at ourselves and to gain perspective, not just to focus on the student. The need to keep in mind that neuroception, that sense of picking up whether the environment is dangerous, that this can impact the sense of safety, and what can we do to calibrate the stress response for the student and helping them feel safe again. This requires from the adult to adjust the circumstances for the student, the physical environment, to help them stay out of trouble through structures, routines that minimize the stress intake. There's an interesting study that came out from Claire Beaumont in 2016. In her study, she talked about the impact of adult-student relationships in schools. And this was a Quebec-based study. And in her study, she found that the more students experienced negative treatments from the adults, that the adults were rude, that they stared at students with contempt, that they yelled at students, had insults towards students, humiliated students, ignored students when they were being mistreated by others, etc. That the more adults gave a negative treatments to students, the more aggressive behavior happened between peers, and the more adults reported being attacked by students. And this study also showed the opposite, that when adults, even though, you know, and I just, I mean, obviously they didn't talk about this in the study, but I can't help but think, even if the study, the teachers or the school staff were to teach social emotional learning, but to the contrary of that, react negatively towards the student, how can one happen if the other one is not in a healthy type of setup? And so in this study, Claire Beaumont was able to show the opposite as well, that when adults take the time to be patient, to be compassionate, to preserve the dignity of the students, to attend to their needs, that the less students were aggressive between themselves and the more students were caring towards the adults. And so this comes from the adults, you know, reminding ourselves that the whole experience needs to be empowering for the teen, not just causing them discomfort and distress, that our expectations must be realistic and adapted to the teen's individual needs and differences, that it's about collaboration and support, that even when the teen is showing signs of maturation, it doesn't mean that they don't need us anymore, that we are still there to nurture and guide them. And so Gordon Neufeld has shown that when there is a positive and deep attachment, and I don't have time here to deepen each of the 5 levels of attachment. You know, I've done this in other presentations, and you can find this in some of the material from the Neufeld Institute. But when there is a deep attachment happening, that this in turn will make space for growth spontaneously. And so all true growth emanates from a place of rest. And rest can only happen if there's a sense of connection and safety. And so our role is not to push and pull on the growth, it's to set up the conditions for growth to unfold naturally. And so with safe relationships, we look at the brackets here on the outside, with safe relationships and with offering emotional playgrounds, we are allowing for the heart to remain soft, for the student to be at rest, for those vulnerable emotions to be felt, for that sadness to come out, for there to be rest and relief, for there to be healing and recovery if needed. And all of this will lead to optimal functioning and resilience and growth. The other thing that's interesting about attachment is not only through a sense of safety and connection does it allow for the student to feel at rest and to grow, but we actually have a natural influence in our attachment. Our attachment has kind of a double benefit, where if our students are able to attach to us through sameness, where they want to be like us, they will follow our rules and values through the attachment of sameness just to be like us. If they want to be loyal to us and to belong, they will follow our rules and values to be loyal and to belong. And through the sense of significance, to be special in our eyes, they will follow again our rules and values just to feel special in our eyes. And so there is a benefit to developing that relationship with students, because if we could get to a place at least of sameness and to some degree some sense of belonging and loyalty, we will have much more natural influence when we are introducing and modeling the rules and regulation. Now, I mentioned before that when the student or the child or adolescent is at rest, that this will make room for growth. I want to talk for a second about what does that look like? What do we mean through the developmental lens, the capacity to grow? And so Gordon Neufeld talks about 3 different processes that as they develop lead to maturation, to growth and maturation. So I will explain each of them. The first one is emergence. The second one is adaptation, and the third one is integration. And so emergence is this capacity for us to become our own person, that we're able to be independent, that we're able to be viable as a separate being, that we are full of vitality, that we're not bored, we're full of questions and curiosity, of interests, that we have a sense of agency and responsibility, that we're venturing forth in our energy, that we have a relationship with ourselves, and that we have a strong quest for independence. And so these are all the fruit of emergence. Now, you'll notice that I've highlighted some of the different keys in the different 3 sections. The reason why I highlighted them is because these are the elements that are named in the Castle model of social emotional learning. So we can see here that the sense of responsibility and having self-awareness, having a relationship with ourselves, is not something that we teach. It is something that develops. There's a potential that unfolds naturally if we set up the right conditions. Same thing with adaptation. Adaptation is about learning from mistakes, accepting limits and restrictions, learning from consequences, adapting to circumstances, having resiliency and being able to be resourceful. All of these things develop on their own if we're able to unfold naturally the process of adaptation. And so again, accepting limits and adapting to circumstances are fruit. They are not skills to be taught. And the same thing for integration. Integration requires prefrontal cortex functioning. It requires for us to have development of integrated functioning. And so being well-tempered, being patient, being courageous, having considerations for others, being civilized, showing empathy, being balanced, having perspective, appreciating context, being able to solve problems, learning from dissonance. All of these are fruit of integration and can only unfold naturally if we put in the right conditions. So if we go back to the 5 areas of SEL: self-awareness, responsible decision-making, relationship skills, social awareness, self-management, these are the different things that are required developmentally for these to unfold naturally. First of all, having a developed attachment, because as I mentioned before, if we can feel safe and that we've got a good role model and we have a deep attachment, these things will unfold naturally. If we're able to feel our emotions, especially the sense of safety, the sense of caring, the sense of responsibility, these are the feelings that we need in order to temper our emotions, to be able to remain vulnerable and soft. Because if we're not vulnerable and soft, we're not going to feel our feelings, and then we cannot have access. Even if we have the potential, we don't have access to the fruit. Of course, having a prefrontal cortex that is developed, having the fruit of emergence, the fruit of adaptation, the fruit of integration, and just as important, if not more, having the adult support and modeling. And so all of this is what's going to lead to these 5 different areas. And so if we were to compare them side by side, where on the one hand, the adult is going to focus on emotional support and accompaniment. And on the other side, we've got the coercive self-regulation through the SEL lens. So on the left-hand side, being aware of the adult's own emotional state and stress response as a priority. Focusing on the student's sense of safety, sensations and feelings, as well as the adult-student dynamic. Helping the student to find balance through the adult's own soothing posture and tone. Supporting the student in their upset, even when they're hostile. Adapting the circumstances accordingly. Of course, it needs to be safe. Acting like a thermostat to hold a steady temperature. meeting the student's need through the application of specific measures of support and accompaniment. And we're going to talk a lot about that in the third section of this presentation. And providing a debrief and follow-up, creating a preventative plan of action for the future. So in comparison, the course of self-regulation prematurely through the SEL lens. And so in that perspective, we would be focusing on external elements to fix and control the problem. We would be focusing on the student's behavior, what they've done wrong. We'd be looking to stop the inappropriate behavior through the adult's authoritative posture and tone. We would be upping the ante when the student is hostile to attempt to shut it down, acting like a thermometer that reacts to the rise of the student's behavior. So there's a difference between the thermostat and the thermometer. The thermostat, we are the ones that set the tone, whereas the thermometer, guys, think about your CPI training or your BMS training, thinking about the de-escalation approach. So we're not being triggered by, and of course it will happen that we may be triggered by the student. And then it's important to work as a team and have a colleague that steps in, or for us to recognize that trigger and to take a step back. But acting like a thermometer that reacts to the rising of the student's behavior, focusing on the outcome and how to achieve it by applying consequences, for example. And so here we're focusing on the results. Here we're focusing on the student's needs. And oftentimes, unfortunately, with an SEL approach, we're focusing on the now, in the immediate. And so there isn't often a debrief, a follow-up, a plan of action beyond the incident. And this is where it makes a difference day and night, not just to be preventative, but to have a plan in place and to adjust the plan accordingly as we're unfolding. And so now we're going to look at how do we put in place through the pyramid of intervention, nurturing emotional health and growth at the high school level. And so looking at through universal practices for all, a school-wide support, a whole class approach. So we're going to look at the universal first, then we're going to look at, so what can we do for some students that need more than the universal support, having more targeted practices, having small group support. And of course, for our tier 3 kids, the most challenging students that we have, how can we put in place individualized practices and personalized one-to-one support? So for you that are here, if you are support staff, you will support the teacher in the universal practices during class time, and during transition time, recess time, break time, or lunch time or whatnot. You would get involved at the universal practices then during transitions. You would support the teacher and this could happen during class time, or it could be through a pull-up model, or it could be during break or lunch, where we're doing targeted practices in small group. And you would be very much involved, especially at the tier 3 in individualized practices, the personalized one-to-one. So before I get into the tier 1, I just want to mention that the best approaches are systemic, not piecemeal. There must be buy-in from the top and the bottom. I mean, in terms of the staff. So it's not just the kids or not just the adults. There needs to be a systemic approach. Emotions can't be addressed only in a 10-minute morning meeting or every Thursday, fourth period. It has to be an everyday thing. It has to become part of the school's DNA. There needs to be a common vision and language among all stakeholders. And so the students, the staff, the parents, the community, everybody. It has to be integrated into leadership, instruction, family meetings, family engagement, hiring procedures, and policies. Also, the best efforts towards emotion are proactive, not reactive. Being proactive means we don't wait for problems to arise and we deal with them and then deal with them. We adopt measures to prevent them. In some schools, this means a shift in mindset from focusing primarily on having students follow the rules to supporting students preventatively by creating emotional spaces, safe spaces for them, and having a plan in place, of course. And so let's keep in mind, as we're going to walk through the 3 tiers, are keys to cultivating resiliency. And so fostering that sense of safety, making room for emotional expression. And the third one that I hadn't mentioned before, and we're going to look at it now in the 3 tiers, is creating opportunities for students to discover and build their sense of strength, courage, and confidence. And we're going to look at that. So for tier 1, we're looking now at tier 1 for the whole group approach. Measures that are done in the preventative mode. These are things that are done on a daily practice. And so How can we foster that sense of safety and predictability with students through the structures and routines in the class, having diverse and inclusive practices? And I do understand at the high school, it's a bit more tricky than at the elementary because, students have many teachers. Sometimes, depending on the school, teachers don't have their own classroom. They are rotating, and they don't have a class to their own to set up. But I would say that even if this is the case, it is important as a school team that we decide, and be on the same page about what are those basic fundamentals in the setup of the space that need to be there to help the student be more successful. How can we cultivate a sense of connection and belonging, in the classroom? And so through the adult greeting, through classroom meetings, through activities for inclusion and team building, involving them into interest in social clubs, having family and community involvement. How can we build that sense of a connection and belonging, not just in the classroom, but in the school? Creating opportunities to build a sense of strength. And so helping students try new things that they wouldn't do before because it is scary to try new things, attempting to face a challenge, allowing ourselves to make that mistake through safe practices. And so oftentimes students are hard enough on themselves, that they have the perception that we have high expectations, making it possible for them to do safe practices, that it is okay to make mistakes, that, how can they face challenges, try new things? And if it can't be for real through an evaluation, can we set up opportunities, even if it's in the play mode, for them to try new things and to experience what it's like to make a mistake, and that it's okay that they've survived it. It's not the end of the world to make that mistake. Um, One thing that I should mention that is coming up through the Ministry of Education as of, and it's not official as of this year. I mean, in terms of the day-to-day practice, this will be coming to your schools, and so the ministry is looking between now and 2028 to expect for students to have emotional literacy, to be exposed to emotional literacy, to be introduced to emotional concepts. And so, I mean, for them, they're going to talk about social and emotional learning. I would invite you guys to shift that and to looking at nurturing emotional health and growth. And so how can we, with our students, help them build not just that emotional literacy, but to introduce and model emotional expression with or without words? And this is going to come down from the pike anyway as an expectation from the ministry. And so might as well cater to the students in the appropriate way. For those more challenging groups, can we think about adding extra time for them to have breaks in emotional respite, providing opportunities for them to release emotions in engaging ways? And I'll give you concrete examples of what I mean. But before I get there, I want to finish up this first part. And so being able to support implicitly through the cross-curricular competencies, everyday practice, helping them build their executive functioning skills. By the way, nurturing emotional health and growth doesn't need necessarily for us to put tons and tons of extra additional time. A lot of that can be built in to the academics already. And so, for example, activities that promote student interaction and cooperative learning. And so that having them practice doing schoolwork in partnership, in triads, in small group, in whole group interaction, the more that they get these opportunities to be exposed and to manage relationships in those dyads or triads, the more that we can help them grow from that. Having activities that are explorative in nature to help them build their self-awareness and their social awareness, helping them see that there is diversity and need for inclusion. And of course, this requires adult introduction and modeling. Can we put in place project-based activities, having students incorporate their voice and their choice in this? Because if they don't feel that their voice is being heard and that they have a sense of control to some extent, their engagement in it won't be as meaningful and authentic. And so through these project-based activities, if we can give them to some degree a sense of voice and choice, this will make all the difference. Can we select different activities that will help them reflect on shifting from an I, sense of I, me, myself, and I, to a we, and that there is an interbeing, and that there is an impact, to have consideration for others, to be able to make space to grow empathy, and remembering that we can plant a seed, we can introduce it, we can model it. These are not things that we can teach directly, but it doesn't mean that we can't plant the seed and work on the conditions. And the last piece is putting in place activities that highlight the paradox, that help to practicing building perspective and cognitive dissonance. Because if we're able to make space for this, this will help students to practice mixing thoughts and emotions. Now, in terms of support staff, what can support staff do at Tier 1 to help support the teacher? And so helping staff, so as a support staff, helping other staff and students familiarize themselves with the role and involvement that support staff have in terms of supporting emotional development. Like in terms of your scheduling in a week, when and where and how are you involved? Can you be accessed for that support? What tools and strategies are available to them that you've put together, that you've created, that you've set aside? The rules and parameters and accessing your services and so forth. When needed and relevant, supporting the teacher, and I'm talking about Tier 1 here, but supporting the teacher and cultivating that sense of belonging, to animate groups, to be involved there, to facilitate activities, to build emotional literacy, and to model the use of body language, facial expression to convey emotion, and to animating breaks or emotional release activities if needed. And so there's, in terms of building that relationship, there's a wonderful video out of Editopia that talks about the importance of building relationships. Again, through Editopia, that gave examples of different brain break activities that can be done at the high school level. And so what are those opportunities for them to express emotions? Having the adult invite emotions, making it okay to release all the range of emotions, not just the good ones. Creating conditions to express, ideally in the preventative mode, providing time, space, and the materials needed to channel those the emotional energy. And for adults to model different safe and healthy ways to express emotions, including expression that are with or without words. And so the person who wrote the Reclaiming Our Students book, Hannah Beach, also created an Inside Out handbook. And so in her Inside Out handbook, you've got the link here to the website to go and get the Inside Out handbook. The password is experience. And so you will find numerous ideas inside the handbook that can be adapted to high school. And these are there to express, to feel, to name, and so forth. So I invite you strongly to go and take a look at that handbook. Now, there are other examples of emotional playgrounds. This could be done through singing, through storytelling, through journaling, through poetry, through drama, through dancing and movement, through playing a musical instrument, through art, whether it's drawing, painting, or even freestyle doodling. And I do understand that it might be difficult to do this during class time. This could be done through break. This could be done through lunchtime. It could be that there's, there's more when we're going to talk about the Tier 2 and 3, that there's a pull-out model where we pull out small groups or individual students, and that this could be tried out during those periods of time. Setting up opportunities to name emotions. And so for adults to support in the building of emotional literacy through stories, through images of emotion with real faces, through songs, lyrics, poetry, and so forth. Adult modeling the identification of emotions, not just the rote memorization of the words of the language, but being able to identify and to recognize our inner emotional experience and to match the right words, symbols, or images that will describe it. This can be done through play, via, through art, through music, and so forth. Naming emotions can be, as I mentioned, can be done not just through words, but through images and symbols. The importance of vulnerability, to be in touch with our feelings. Without feeling our emotions, it makes it very difficult for us to match the word to an emotional experience that we cannot feel. And so if we can help students to feel safe, and that in turn they will soften and be more vulnerable, then these opportunities will be much more easy. Now, I have here an example of an emotion feeling wheel where you've got the core emotions, and from there will range, all of the range of different emotions within those categories. This could be something that you can use. But and remember, we're talking about tier 1 here. But you'll see that at tier 3, we're going to talk about, and I'll get there after, but this is something that Center of Excellence has created as what we call a squawk box, and for allowing students individually to help them recognize their emotions, to match the words to their inner experience and so forth. Now in terms of tier 2, and so now we're looking more at targeted practices. And so these practices would be done in small groups. This is not meant for all students. This is meant for those students that for whom tier 1's not enough. And so looking at additional measures to put in place to help foster that sense of safety and belonging, whether we're putting in place check-ins, those students may need to have a check-in with a significant adult, or that we may put in place small group projects. In terms of scaffolding, targeted practices for the executive functioning, because those kids have more challenges in terms of organization, in terms of time management, and so forth, to be able to support them with that. Scheduling breaks for those students, assigning tools and materials to help them with emotional respite. In terms of additional targeted practices in small groups, in order to help them release emotion and for them to express emotion, opportunities for emotional development. All of this could be done either in a pull-out model, or it could be done in during break or during a lunch. So for support staff, what can support staff do at tier 2? And so implementing those check-ins for those students, you're the ones that might be involved in that one-to-one check-in or that small group check-in. Supporting the teacher in introducing and modeling the use of those tools and materials which have been assigned to the student, whether it's a sensory tool, whether it's a flexible seating, whatever that is, to be able to help support the student. Being involved in the scheduling of breaks and what happens during those breaks, to animate small groups during lunch or through a pull-out model for social development, emotional development, for respite, and creating those materials, whether it's visuals, checklists, get ready, do done. The get ready, do done is an executive functioning tool to help students that have a hard time with getting a task done, to help them into figuring out how to prepare and plan to get that, because they're not able to see the end product. Having visuals like the first and then and so forth, to support students with their executive functioning challenges. And so these would be examples at tier 2. And so having that check-in, whether it's done first thing in the morning, whether it's done during break or lunch, or at the end of the day, you get to figure out for that student what it is that they would benefit more from. For some students, it could be a few times a week. By the time we get to tier 3, it's most oftentimes every day. Having to set up, whether it's in the classroom or in the hallway, is there, or even an alternative space, can students have a quiet space where they can go because they're not able to focus, because they're distracted by the group, because they have emotions they need to address, and to be able to have those resources available for the student upon need, but also to schedule them preventatively. And this will benefit not just the student, but also the group and the staff. In terms of movement, being able to set up some fitness circuits. You could have, set up a space somewhere in the building. It could even be through the gym, where students can go and let out some of that emotion, that frustration or fear or whatever that is. Sometimes physical movement can help. Breathing exercises could be something. There's so many different ways. Doing fine motor activities. There's many different examples of this. And so this would be for tier 2. And now for tier 3, in terms of the individualized practices, we are looking at the one-to-one support measures. These are for the few students, those highly challenging students for whom the tier 1 and 2 is not enough. And so for those students, we've got additional measures that are put in place to help them, again, to foster their sense of safety and belonging, having systematic check-ins. Those are done most probably every day, maybe a few times a day. If you're a school that has a nurturing support center in place, or an oasis room, a room where support staff are available, having that student have some time to go there. Having special projects for that student, allotted responsibilities for them, where they could help with recycling, help with a different job or whatnot. This could help them build a sense of belonging to the school where they feel valued, they feel needed. Having an adapted schedule to help them to reset their amygdala. And so the amygdala is the emotional, if I remember at the beginning of the presentation, I talked about the emotional brain, and that's what orchestrates the whole stress response. And so if they can have access to a space where they can reset, they can neutralize their amygdala to be able to have an adult to co-regulate with, very much needed for those students at tier 3. Having additional personalized support measures on the one-to-one basis, whether it's to release emotion, to express emotions in through different mediums, and to build that emotional resiliency. So feeling safe, but also to be able to help them find their strength and confidence. And so additional personalized opportunities to build their sense of strength on a one-to-one basis. It could be through a project or something of interest. And personalizing a plan to help compensate. If the student is having a hard time during lunch and during breaks, they get themselves into trouble with peers, we may need to put in place an adapted schedule for them to go to an alternative setting, for them to be more safe and not get into trouble, to compensate and to scaffold for their immaturity and their defendedness, which impacts their executive functioning in turn, to have in place a concrete plan. So we're not just doing this in a random way. We are setting up for the tier 3 students an official formalized plan, and that we know in the plan what are the students' challenges, what are the needs, what are the goals to help answer to those challenges, what are the support measures that are in place, what are the tools and materials that we've selected to be able to help, and so forth. This needs to be done systematically and concretely. All of the team that is involved with that student needs to be around the table to help put together that plan. Because the problem with not having a plan and that things are done more randomly or not systematically is not only are we not getting the benefits, but the other adults that don't know, for example, like the teacher who doesn't know what the support staff is doing in the alternative space and time, may think that we're just hanging out and having fun, and that nothing is coming from that. And so to be able to make that plan more concrete, and that the teacher gets to know what it is that you're doing with that student. I'm working on this challenge. This is the, so if you could even put it a table, so you have like one column is the challenges and needs. The other column is what are the objectives to answer for those needs and objectives, and in terms of supporting the needs and the challenges. The next column would be, what are those support measures that I've put in place to answer to those objectives? And then the other column after that would be, what tools and materials have I selected to fulfill that measure, that answer to that objective, to support that need? And so when the teacher walks down the hallway and sees you playing cards with the student, they know that it's not just a random thing, and you're not just letting time pass. You've selected playing cards with that student for a specific reason. And so, by the way, I have a separate presentation that I did quite a few months ago called Tools versus Toys. And I walk through, the difference between a tool and a toy, and the difference. It could be the exact same item, but in the way that you've made it more systematic and that you have an intention behind it, now the toy has become a tool. And so it's so important for the staff to understand that the work that you are doing, that there's a reason behind it. It is not just random. And so support staff would be implementing student daily check-ins, would be being involved in creating the adapted schedule and supporting the student in alternate locations, whether it's a nurturing support center or elsewhere during those blocks of time. We would be introducing and modeling while in that alternative space. And I'm saying NSC, but it could be another space if that's what you don't have in your school, to use those tools and materials which have been assigned to the student, creating materials for them, whether it's visuals, checklists, the Get Ready, Do Done tool, the first and then visuals to support the student with their executive functioning challenges, and supporting and collaborating with the teacher during debriefs, involved in the repair and recovery process for that student. And so I mentioned putting together a plan. This is one example of a plan that Eva D'Agostini had put together that's available on the website. We've got you could use your own. Honestly, it doesn't really matter what it looks like. As I mentioned, it could even be a grid with those different columns. Make it your own. And so in terms of those daily check-ins with the student, it can't just be for an academic agenda. It has to be genuine. You're doing a genuine touch point with the student. You're connecting with them first, talking about their interest for a minute, before we get into, do they have their materials? Do they seem to be ready to go to class, and so forth? Because if the touch point is not genuine, the student will not reap the benefits of that check-in. Check their current emotional state. Check if there's any potential triggers in that moment. Evaluate their capacity to be in class and their readiness to learn. Do they have the necessary materials? Are they in a place where they're receptive to learn in that moment, or do they need to reset themselves before they go to class? Reminding them of their strength and to help them towards achieving their goals, letting them know you believe in them. They so need this, that sense of belief in their capacity. Examples of sensation or emotional playgrounds that we could be using on that one-to-one, whether through art, music, or journaling, whether through a sensation tech a toolbox where we could put different items in there to help with their sensations. It could be activities like drawing the music. It could be a sensory body map to help them figure out in their bodies, how do they feel? What does their body react to different emotions? It could be journaling. It could be mapping, doing poems, excuse me, about their feelings, noticing and naming their emotions, having stories and role playing around emotion. So it's one step. It's one step removed if we're doing it through a character. If we're doing role playing, than it is if we're doing it for ourselves. At tier 3, a student would benefit from having an individual bin. And in that bin, we could have things like a journal book. We could have different reading materials. We could have sensory materials, fine motor activities, anything that could help them to be engaged, but also give them respite from their stress of academics. Being sure that if there is academics in the bin, that these are things that they can do independently and that is not too demanding for them. In order to put it in a bin, this helps for it to be transported from one location to the next. You'll notice in the bin down here that there's fidgets as well, and so that could be another item that you could put into the bin. Having time in an alternative space. And so I mentioned the Nurturing Support Center. The Nurturing Support Center is a space that the Center of Excellence has designed. The space has been divided in it with a specific intention in mind. The materials that are there, the philosophy, the approach, the training of the adults, all of this has been thought through. And so there's a section on the website where you can go and take a look at that if you don't have that in your school. If you do have that in your school, and want to know more, then I invite you to go and take a look at the webpage. As I mentioned, in the Nurturing Support Center or in an alternative location, you can have different emotion tools. This is one that CBM created, and you can download it on the website for free. You don't have to use this one. This is one example. You can make your own. And so this idea behind here is that we've got emotion cards, and it's really important to have faces because sometimes students don't recognize the words. The words don't speak to them, but the facial expression speaks to them. And so it's important to have something that has visuals and that has true faces, not just cartoon characters. In the box, you have a folder that comes with it. In the box, there's a legend that explains each of the different cards that go in there. And there are also tools that are in that box. So I invite you to go and take a look. There's a video capsule that explains how to use the box. And so I invite you to go and take a look at that. Another thing that we could be doing with a student, whether it's through physical activity or it's through different types of explorative activities, to help them in the preventative mode to notice their bodies. Notice how their bodies react to certain situations, in terms of how their tummy feels, in terms of how the tension in their muscles and so forth. So many kids are disconnected body and mind. And so to help them to notice their bodies, help them to try different rhythms. This could be done through music. It could be done through different instruments, sounds and so forth to help them to figure out what's the difference between something that is very fast paced and something that is more slow paced and so forth, to help them with that. Breathing exercises, sensory experiences, movement activities through yoga, through stretching or whatnot, helping them to discover their bodies and their sensations through all of that. Now we're getting to a close. I'm at my concluding slide to review this whole presentation. And so reminding ourselves that emotions seek to be released and expressed. Suppressing may have serious repercussions on mental health and well-being. Emotions seek to be felt. If not, they cannot fulfill their job and cannot be managed. That emotions require mixing in order to balance. And so emotion regulation isn't about cutting out the impulses, it is about adding the tempering element. And so for that frustration to bring the care, the responsibility, or another type of feeling, and the same thing for the fear or other emotions. although social emotional learning is about emotions, it gives precedent to reason, and it does not truly honor the natural laws of emotions nor the steps towards emotional maturity. And so the way through here is nurturing emotional health and growth. And although nurturing emotional health and growth needs certain conditions, ultimately it's about letting nature do its job and becoming the midwife to the process. And so it's not about us tugging and pulling at the result. It's about setting up the stage and letting nature do run its course. I invite you guys to go and take a look at the CBM website. We've got tons of resources. I have a whole section dedicated to high school on that website. And I have a whole second website called the CBM Resource Center. And on there, I've got tons and tons of material, tools, resources, webinars. I invite you to go and take a look at that as well. Thank you so much for being here today. So I will stop the recording.